I don't think the point of Game Maker's Toolkit, I don't think the point of Game Maker's Toolkit is to be like a design course. Like, I don't think it's meant to be, I'm gonna teach you how to do game design. I think it's more meant as just like a general design appreciation kind of channel, and there's sort of this sense of like, look, there's a lot more that goes into design than a lot of people realize, and to that extent it does its job pretty well. However, irrespective of its intent, I do see a lot of people referencing it as like a thing to go to for people who are trying to learn game design. And that bothers me. And that's one of the things that really sort of motivates me to do something like this, is because one of my goals here is definitely to look at something like Game Maker's Toolkit and be able to break down why Game Maker's Toolkit why it's not a good educational resource for design. Again, I don't think that's what the point of the channel is. I think it's more about design appreciation, and it's pretty good about that. It's pretty good at design appreciation. But one of the things, not the only thing by any stretch, but one of the things I want to do, and the reasons that I wanted to look at Game Maker's Toolkit specifically, is I did want to explain sort of why I don't think it's a very good educational tool for game design. It might be a good supplemental tool, right? There are probably things in it that are like, okay, that's fine, but I've seen it a couple times on various places, predominantly like Reddit, where people are saying, hey, like, I want to learn how to do game design, where should I start? And people are going, watch Game Maker's Toolkit. I'm like, no, this isn't Game Maker's Toolkit is not a design education replacement. It absolutely is not. And it's like, it's just terrible advice. And that's one of the things that makes me want to do this specifically. But there are a couple other things. I do want to go over, like, here's how we want to look at game design. And one thing that I want to point out too is, I want to point out a couple things in a video where if someone gave this as an answer to, like, if you ask them, what were your thoughts on this game that you built? Like, why did you build it this way? There are some answers that I think we'll probably find that wouldn't hold up very well in like a proper professional design setting, because it doesn't imply anything. It might work in a colloquial setting, but, or again, in the context of game appreciation. So again, I haven't really watched this video. I've skimmed it a little bit to see sort of where we can sort of get started, but that's about it. So we're really pretty much just getting unfiltered thoughts. And again, this is very discussion oriented. So if anybody has any comments on what we're watching, throw them out. We're gonna stop very frequently and talk about things. We're gonna do a lot more talking than watching. So I'm gonna start this thing. Before I jump forward, everyone, let me know how the volume is, the volume levels, because, oops, let me actually play it, that'll help. Because, oh, also, hang on, I am, very much need to get rid of that. Okay, yeah, let me know if the volume's okay, and then we'll jump in properly. I've also put on closed captions, obviously. That should help.
To unlock a new ability. This might be something funky like a brand new move, or something a little less exciting like a few extra health points. Skill trees like this were first found in number-crunching RPGs like Diablo 2, but have since become ubiquitous in big-budget action games, in everything from Spider-Man to
Okay, we're gonna jump ahead a little bit because he's just doing sort of an intro. Let's jump to about
of the game. If you started moveset opens up incrementally.
I think there's already some stuff I actually want to talk about, but we're gonna jump to the good stuff.
Over the course of the game. At the start of the adventure, you're weak and only have a few special powers.
So, okay.
By the end,
so of course this is all about building better skill trees. And he's setting it up as skill trees as a method of progression, which is obviously a good thing. This is going over some really basic stuff. I think a lot of this is just yeah, all this stuff is just like you want some anticipation for because progression itself is not enough. You want some feedback for the progression so that players know what to expect.
To do. Someone's got to draw all those icons. But for all their benefits, most
Obviously
games squander their skill tree by making really poor choices about what to put on those branches.
Oh, here we go. This is where it's going to get good.
To talk about some popular mistakes that
popular mistakes. So
how
first of all,
might be able to
I already have an issue, right? Because first of all, he's framing this as here's what a skill tree is, here's what it's supposed to accomplish, and here's the mistakes, which is not correct. Because, hey, ooh, there we go. That's a fun one. Okay, he's already setting up like he's already setting up this like here's what a skill tree is, and that's not really what a skill tree is. Not quite. Like progression, yes, okay, but a skill tree, I mean, if you're putting a skill tree in your game, you should be thinking about why progression is important and why specific decisions in that progression are important and how those change the flow of the gameplay from a perspective of sort of the gameplay loop and all that, especially if you're working all the way from pre-production when none of the game's made yet and you have all the freedom in the world to change all of it. So this framing of here's the common mistakes in skill trees, it's the kind of thing that it's probably okay as like supplemental information if you already are reasonably well versed in the concept of game design and how to build a vision and how to move forward. Having a few extra things to think about, probably a good thing. But if you're brand new to game design and you're learning for the first time that, you know, there even is that much to think about in terms of building a vision and putting it all together and building like good ideation and the good hypotheses that you need to put together, this is terrible advice. So, or it's not advice. That's the wrong way to look at it. He's not giving advice, but this is not a way you should look at it if you're in that circumstance. And then the idea of it's a mistake and I need to fix it. This is a way of looking at objective quality in game design as like things are mistakes and there are solutions to those mistakes, rather than objectivity being this like cohesive unit where it's all about building a single sort of internally consistent concept. Whereas this is less like objectivity in game design and more like absolute. It's not like objective quality, it's absolute quality, which is not a great way to look at it, because if you're looking at things in terms of absolute quality, you end up with this idea of like, well, you know, whatever he says is good, and you should do those things, and those things are good. And whatever he says are mistakes, and you shouldn't do those things. And that's going to inevitably, I can already see where this is going, right? He's going to end with a conclusion of, but also, these aren't always mistakes, it's contextual. But then what we would need is like, well, but how does the context influence when it's the right decision or not, right? So you can already see where that it's not really an argument, but you can already see where that train of thought is leading inherently. And this is where people run into problems when they try to look at objectivity in game design, and they don't think about objectivity as like an internally coherent concept, and more about absolute quality, which isn't a thing.
Fix them.
So let's keep going.
A lot of games that feature skill trees will allow the player to unlock most of the upgrades, if not all of them, by the end of the game, just through a normal amount of play.
Also, again, any comments, throw them out at any point. I'm going to keep an eye on chat and try to get them going.
And this really misses an opportunity to make players think hard about their choices.
Surprise, surprise. I have another problem.
Great. If not,
this is all fine. This is just a really throwaway statement. A lot of games that feature skill trees will allow player to unlock almost all of it. Sometimes, whatever.
If not all of them, by the end of the game, just through a normal amount of.
First of all, I'd want to know like what he means by a lot, although I guess it's not super relevant, but it seems like he's about to lay out why that's a problem.
And this really misses an
because the way this is well, I guess let's watch and see. Well, let's not make the assumption.
About what order they unlock the skills, when they could be thinking about which upgrades they'll actually be able to get. I personally enjoyed the skill tree
Okay, so yeah, what he's saying is it seems to imply that the idea of the decision point being you can get skill X or Y, and once you get skill X, you can't get skill Y, or some sort of variation on that, where you don't get all of them, so you have to sort of pick certain ones. You have to pick, I want A and not B. I want C and not D. And that decision to also, the additional decision of not D does affect the way that tension plays out. But that affects the nature of the tension. It's not as though one is inherently superior to the other one for a couple reasons. And this is why objectivity over absolute quality is so much more effective of a way to approach analysis. And objectivity requires conditionals, whereas absolute quality does not require conditionals. It requires that you merely make truth statements about a thing. So a better way to think about this might be, if you want your player to make a meaningful decision between two abilities, then removing the ability to go back and pick it up later, because you've locked yourself out of the option to get that at all once you get the other one, will drive the tension of that specific decision much further. Whereas if you can get them all eventually, and it's more about the order in which you get them, then there's less tension in specifically which abilities you pick up. That's a good statement. But that's really it. That's the good statement, and that's the end of the statement. Having exclusive skills are inherently better versus... Yes. Yeah, exactly. Like the idea, the implication of, basically. Because then the objective statement you can make is, here is how making exclusive skills changes the gameplay experience, or changes the experience of looking through their skills. And again, that's going to be contextual. So you then add on how that changes the experience for your game in the context of what you are building. Whereas what he's laid out is, exclusive skills are better because it's a stronger decision point. But you don't want everything in your game to be a strong decision point, right? You need to determine which decision points are the highest priorities, and also having decision points that are really put front and center that shouldn't be, that don't drive your gameplay experience, very frequently actively detracts from your gameplay experience inadvertently.
Enjoyed the skill tree.
What would be a good example of that here? If you have something like a more casual game where it's about, yes, right, you can't say something is better universally. You can say something is better objectively and then make an argument for that. And that's not the same as saying it is because good or bad, the issue I think is he's starting with this idea of objectivity exists in game design, and that means a thing can be objectively good or bad, but that's not true, because good and bad are abstract qualitative terms. And they don't mean anything, but you can make objective statements instead of qualitative statements. It's kind of, so sometimes decision paralysis, analysis paralysis, sometimes that'll be why it detracts. But a lot of times, if you just imply, because when there's a hard decision point or a decision point that's put really front and center, then players will assume that that's important. And if it turns out to not be important, then what you're inadvertently teaching your player is, some of the things that you're going to be told, some of the decisions you have to make matter, and some of them don't. And now the player is either going to start trying to figure out which decisions matter and which don't, in which case that's now the tension of the game. Which decisions should I focus on? So your tension has shifted, right? The nature of your tension has shifted into something that you didn't want it, and now you have no control over the gameplay experience anymore. You've lost control of it completely. Or yes, something like analysis paralysis, where the player just has too many options and they can't decide, and it's like, well, I don't care anymore, right? There are a lot of different ways that can sort of backfire on you, which is why the best thing to do is just go, here are the key decision points we want to do. Let's drive those decision points. If you want, sometimes people just want sort of a much more general idea of progression, where like in their game, they might decide that they want the progression that they're designing to be pretty broad, pretty simple. Like they want there to be progression, because that helps represent player progression, and it reduces the strain on the player, reduces the burden on the player to improve themselves, which is great for more casual games. right? Because a pure skill game like an esport, for example, right? There is no, when you level up in StarCraft, you don't unlock like, you know what I mean? You don't unlock like more damage units or anything. Leveling up, playing more games doesn't level you up and then you progress and then you rise the ladder. You rise on the ladder by virtue of your skill and understanding. It's not casual. Whereas if you're playing especially a single player game and it's a very simple progression system, then you have this ability to pull the player through and aid them a lot more, and it creates a slightly less intense experience. And you can add decision points in different areas. If you think about something like a game like Skyrim is probably a pretty good example of that, where I'm sure there are things that you can do to improve your skill at Skyrim, but there's not a ton. It's not like a super in-depth tactical game or anything. Mostly you unlock way better stuff and you just get more powerful as your skills increase and you get better equipment and you learn better spells and all that stuff. As long as you have enough, you gain enough cheese wheels to survive every attack, whatever. That's a great example where progression drives the upgrade system drives almost all of the player progression, and there's almost no player progression in terms of player skill. And to say that Skyrim's progression system is worse than the Assassin's Creed Origins progression system, based on the fact that the Assassin's Creed system drives player decisions in a much more front and center way, is insane. Because player decisions surrounding progression are not a matter of efficacy, they're a matter of expression. Right? So the experience that those two skill trees are driving are fundamentally different. They're totally different things. Probably incomparable. All right. Let's continue.
In Assassin's Creed Origins, because I definitely wasn't able to afford all of the skills by the end of the game. Instead,
same thing.
I had to specialize. I focused on the Hunter and Seer branches, which were all about improving my abilities in stealth and increasing my options in taking out camps through tricking the AI and causing chaos.
Thanks.
This
maybe we'll
cool outcomes,
maybe we'll throw that up somewhere.
My game felt personal to me, and his skills fit the way I chose to play the game. But there were also interesting repercussions for my choices. By neglecting the warrior branch, I was pretty lackluster at one-on-one combat. I often had to run away from direct encounters and find new ways.
This is great. This is a great example, because if you took that statement, the statement about how his progression made him lackluster at one-on-one combat, if you just change the framing, that statement is now evidence for why it's a terrible progression system. If you just change the question that you're trying to answer. This is why I'm so big on tacit questions. Because if you just change the question that you're answering, that's now evidence against the thing he's arguing for. I just wanted to point that out.
To approach situations. Immersive sims are...
Although it depends on the game, right? Like if you have a progression system where you can make that exact situation happen, except the game is exclusively geared toward combat, suddenly the thing that he's trying to say is inherently a superior design choice is just going to break everything and is actually a horrific design choice.
Are also good at showing the repercussions of picking certain skills. In the Deus Ex games, certain paths and options will be locked out based on the upgrades that you've chosen, forcing you to find alternate routes that better suit your character.
Okay, it's exactly the same. I have the exact same issue with that statement, where you could take that out of context, change the question that you're answering, and again, it's evidence against the thing that he's saying. It's one thing that I like that he's saying, one thing that I definitely agree with, that's a good point, is that the idea that you're driving what is it? This idea of showing the different ways to approach a situation and showing off repercussions of picking one skill over another. Again, if we make that a conditional statement and we make it more like, if we want the player to make meaningful decisions about the sort of upgrade path that they take, and we're defining that as they make significantly different decisions in how to approach a scenario based on their upgrade path, then we would want to see players who take different skill paths then also express that skill path in gameplay in a specific way, where if you take path A, you're stealth. If you take path B, you're loud. If you take path C, there's the tech hacking stuff. That's the Deus Ex thing. It's been a long time since I played Deus Ex, but something like that. And then I would just add on to that, it's really important that those upgrade paths imply ahead of time what that is going to mean for the player later. So I've made this example, I've given this example a few times, of the idea of making a decision, the decision that the player is making versus the decision that's being presented to the player. Because the decision that's being presented to the player and the decision that the player is making aren't always the same thing. And it's really important that you, in general, put those things together, put those things in concert with one another, because otherwise you end up with the left-right divide. And the left-right divide is the problem. It's the hallway problem. I'm going to call it the hallway problem. The hallway problem is when you have what do you think? Okay, oh, that's actually a good question. I'd rather answer that. So I think it's become a tacit question because he has locked himself into this idea that games can be... Here's what I think has happened, and this is pretty much pure conjecture. But it seems like he's locked himself into this idea of games can be objectively good or bad, which abstractly I agree with, but I think it's more accurate to say games can be objective, which means that you have to apply an objective framework, which means you ask objective questions. If you start with the abstract and then just move on from that without refining it, what you end up with is games can be objectively good or bad. So then how do you determine what's good or bad? Like that process now is where things start to break down, and it inherently comes with tacit questions, because you really can't go from how do you determine if something is good and then move into the gameplay analysis and just have answers. You're coming with a whole bunch of tacit questions because you're bringing all kinds of baggage with what you consider to be good, and now it's mostly subjective. Like your attempt to make the analysis objective has become self-defeating, is kind of the point there. So anyway, the hallway problem. The hallway problem is when the player is being presented a problem, and the problem can be anything. The problem can even be this really well thought out concept. But if you don't present that problem accurately to the player, then the problem the player is actually dealing with is, do I go left or right? Because the player doesn't have any of that information. It hasn't been presented to them. So they're stuck with this idea of, do I go left or right? And they don't have any of the other information, which creates a disconnect between the problem that's being presented and the problem that they're dealing with. And that's where tension comes in. Tension is about defining what the problem the player is actually dealing with is and why it should be that problem, why that is the decision they should be making. The reason the hallway problem is applicable here is because it 100% applies to skill trees, especially if you're leveling up and you get to the point where you're like, okay, I can take skill A or B. Which skill do I take? Well, one might be an upgrade to this thing and the other is an upgrade to this thing. But is the decision that the player is making the same as the decision being presented? In the Deus Ex example, the decision that's being presented is, how are you likely going to be approaching environmental problems? Are you going to be using combat as a primary solution? Are you going to be using stealth as a primary solution? Or are you going to be using hacking as a primary solution? I don't really remember Deus Ex. But the really nice thing about that is the issue that you might run into is if you're not really clearly presenting the problem, players aren't making the decision that you think they're making. I don't think he's saying games. Well, I think you're mostly right about that. He is missing the mark on the intent of why some skill trees are one way. But I think the issue is that he's decided already, like ahead of time, that skill trees should be a certain way. And the reason he's stuck with that is because I think he's already determined that games can be good or bad. And if you haven't determined ahead of time that games can either be good or bad objectively, then you are less likely to get stuck in this sort of unsolvable problem of how do you determine if it's good or bad? Here's what's good and here's what's bad. Because he's very much presenting these in an objective light, right? He's very much presenting skill trees should drive hard player decisions. And put those player decisions front and center and increase the tension between those gameplay decisions. But like, not necessarily, but he's definitely presenting it as like an objective statement, right? He's saying this is objectively like correct, which seems to imply that his starting point is that there is such a thing as objectively correct. If that makes any sense. I'm gonna play.
In the Deus Ex games, certain paths and options will be locked out based on the upgrades that you've chosen, forcing you to find alternate routes that better suit your character. And in Prey, the more skills you unlock, the more alien you become, right up to the point where friendly turrets now consider you a threat and try to kill you.
So this is another good example. That's fine. This is actually an okay starting point for analysis, because he's saying here's a thing that happens, right? This is a thing that unfolds as a result of player decisions. So now we could build good design statements around that concept. But so far all he's done is make an observation, which is fine. It's an accurate observation, and observation is always the starting point. So great.
Another way skill trees screw up is simply by making the skill.
Then he just moves on to another thing. That's where the issue comes in. So now he just moves on to another thing, where instead of making, like, he sets up a scenario where we could start making meaningful design statements, then he just moves on to a different thing.
Just
Okay. All right, you already know what I'm going to say about this statement. Do I even need to say
really
it?
Boring. Making your attacks do a few percentage points more damage or giving yourself a couple extra health points is just not very exciting.
I'll say it. It's totally qualitative. Like, come on. Here's the thing. Now he's just making full-blown subjective statements, which in some ways I actually prefer, because he's been subjective the whole way. At least now he's acknowledging the subjectivity. The issue is when he's trying desperately to be objective, but keeps running into that same wall over and over and over, because he's set up the problem of objectivity in a really ineffectual way. It's all about setting up your frameworks. If you don't set your frameworks up effectively, they break down really quickly, and it's very difficult to figure out why, because you have all these tacit questions. Like, I really do think he started with this idea that they can be objective, but now he's saying these are objectively not very exciting.
So, brand new powers in Dishonored and exciting new attacks in God of War are far more desirable than a few extra numbers on the game's underlying Excel spreadsheet.
Don't agree. I actually don't agree with that. First of all, now all someone has to say is, no, I really like that upgrade. I really enjoyed the upgrades in this game, and he's just wrong, right? Because now it's subjective. Well, not wrong, but now it's they're at an impasse. I'd say he more than missed the mark with a qualitative statement. It seems like the analysis is starting to break down here. He just doesn't have that. The assumptions that he made at the very start of the video, at the very start of everything here, just weren't a solid enough foundation, and now it's starting to crumble beneath his feet, and he's doing his best to sort of stay on it, which is good, because the thing is, you don't always know that you have a good framework until it's been tested, and until it starts to crumble a little bit, and you can shore it up. So it's good. The problem is when you start making statements like this, when you start making statements like they're just boring or they're just not very exciting, that's a really good indicator that the foundation needs work. But he just keeps pushing forward. And it suggests that he doesn't realize that the framework might not be or that the foundation isn't as solid as it needs to be. Because again, all somebody has to do is say, no, I really liked the upgrades in that game. And now they're opinions are exactly equivalent, right? He's not making any meaningful statement because now someone just says, no, I really liked it. It's the exact same thing. They're equally as valid. Yeah, no, I agree. And you shouldn't, right? I absolutely agree, and I don't think you should. If I was grading a paper and the thesis was it was boring, I was like, okay, that's fine. Like, but this essay is now about you, right? If you're saying I'm writing an essay on this movie and I thought it was boring, your thesis is it was boring. The essay is now about you. It's not about the movie anymore. And it's hard to do that. Human beings are we're egocentric by nature, at least a little bit. Every human being is at least a little bit egocentric by nature. And it's really easy to just go, well, my experience was this and that's relevant, right? And just assume that it's relevant. But it may not be. Sometimes it will be, but it may not be. And I think objectivity is largely about how do we get the experience out of it as much as possible? How do we remove things like confirmation bias? How do we remove things like qualitative assessment? You know, the scientific method is designed specifically for doing that, and it's something that I think about a lot when I'm doing gameplay analysis is, am I making a really clear, really concrete statement? And if not, how can I have done that? Or how can I have set myself up to be able to do that? You know, it's just like Kelvin's got me all into chess lately, and I've been doing a lot of chess stuff, so I'm going to make a chess analogy. Sometimes when you blunder a piece in the late game, the problem was not that you blundered the piece in the late game. The problem was that you broke your structure and you could have lost on turn 15, even if the game goes to turn 60. That can happen. But a player who's as bad at chess as I am usually doesn't notice that the problem was turn 15. And that makes analysis really, really difficult. So the first thing you have to teach yourself how to do is understand how a board state evolves and works on a causal level. And I think you have to do the exact same thing with gameplay analysis. You have to look at how one thing links to the next, and this is why I'm big on tacit questions, because take your tacit questions, and step one is just to have like mindfulness and self-awareness, and take your tacit questions and make them explicit questions. Yeah, movie was paced too slowly. That's probably better. That raises some other questions, however, because when you start with qualitative assessment, it usually suggests that you aren't building from an objective foundation. Now, that statement is itself designed to be highly objective. I'm not saying if you start with the movie was paced too slowly, you're doing bad analysis. I'm saying if you start with a statement like the movie's paced too slowly, it seems likely that you're probably starting from a foundation that isn't very objective, because it's unlikely that you would go from an objective question to a qualitative assessment about pacing, if that makes sense. So like to move that, because if you wanted to move that forward, you get to the point where it's like, what determines if the pacing was too slow? Yeah, what determines that it was too slow or too fast? Too slow relative to what? Is it too slow compared to something else? Ultimately, what the movie was paced too slowly means, usually, is I would have preferred if it was paced faster. And then you can make arguments as to why you would have preferred it. The important thing is to be aware that that's what you're doing now. It's not never make those statements. It's not never say a movie was paced too slowly. It's if you say the movie was paced too slowly, you're in pretty much the realm of qualitative assessment, and the follow-ups to that are pretty much all going to be about why you felt it was too slow, and it's mostly a personal thing. You can absolutely have those conversations. There's exactly zero things wrong with those kinds of conversations. But if you want to be a really effective analytical mind and really hone that sort of, really sharpen that blade, and practice that skill, you need to be able to separate when you're making qualitative versus objective statements. It's not like people will tell me all the time, like, I really enjoyed that game. Cool, great, but we're not talking about the game at that point. Like, you're allowed to say that, and we can have that conversation. That's fine. But we're not having a design discussion. We're not analyzing anything. We're just talking about the game you enjoyed, which go right ahead. But don't then say, that's my analysis of that game, right? Those, you can do either, but just don't try to combine them. All right, we're going to keep going.
And don't forget the rules laid down in Metroid. One ability can serve multiple purposes.
No. Okay. So he said a sentence, half a sentence, and I have another issue. Here's the thing. Well, he's just saying it's a rule laid down in Metroid, right?
Which is both a weapon and a way to navigate.
Might as well
the
let him
world.
finish.
Ultimately, a good skill will make you excited to finally unlock it, and then eager to go into the world and use it.
Okay, so this is a little bit better because he's saying a good skill will make you excited to finally unlock it and then eager to go to use it. And I think the emphasis here is not a good skill will make you excited. I think the emphasis here is a good skill will do both of these things. I think that's really the point. And the idea is you'll be looking forward to it, good, and also you'll be looking forward to using it. That's good. But again, I think this goes all the way back to the conversation we were having at the very beginning of the stream, which is all about it depends on the skill tree, right? If you go back to the casual game, the point of a skill upgrade in Skyrim is definitely that. But also, there's an issue with this in that it becomes qualitative again, because now if I just say I got an ability and I had no choice but to pick that ability, and it just gives me extra damage on my attacks, and that's all it does. If I was excited to unlock it, and then when I got it, I was excited to go attack things with my newfound extra damage, well, then that's a good skill by his own definition. Right? Because he's now shifted all the way into this objective. And
To finally unlock
that's a little bit of an
and
issue
then eager
because
to go into the world and use
because
it.
he starts out with all these really objective statements, and he starts out with all these like really high level sort of like here's what works and here's what doesn't, here's some games that are good and here's some games that are bad, and like shows all the footage, and he talks about like the point of skill trees, and he's setting up the context, and that's all good groundwork. If you're trying to make an argument about what works and what doesn't, that kind of setup is really good groundwork. You should be doing that groundwork. But then he kind of just throws it all away, because now it's basically just like, I'm going to define a good skill in such a way that anything can be phrased in a way that makes it fit this definition. And also it's contingent on whether anyone had that experience. And that's a big part of this. Because if you are doing the more emotional elements of game design, usually what you want to do is you want to look at averages across a large player base. It's because obviously that starts to get really finicky. So in these earlier stages, if you're trying to set up a skill tree and you're trying to set up like what the design goals of a skill tree are, you don't want your design goals to be a skill will make you excited to unlock it and then eager to go use it, right? Imagine if you're a designer and you're trying to build a skill tree, but you're struggling to get started. You don't know what skills there should be. And you can't, you might have thought of a few, but you can't justify any of them. You don't know how to make a design statement about why this skill tree works versus doesn't work versus why this change would make more sense. And you're kind of stuck, which happens all the time because it turns out game design is actually super hard and really complicated. And then someone said, look, ultimately what matters is that the player is excited to unlock it and then also excited to go use it. That doesn't help you. Right? That doesn't take you from I don't know how to do game design to, oh yeah, no, I'm starting to understand the principles a little bit. Right? It doesn't bridge that gap. It's something that you can sort of look back on if you already have a bunch of skills and go, do my skills accomplish this? But even then, sometimes you don't necessarily need to accomplish both of those things. And sometimes you're trying to accomplish something wholly different. Like, for example, it might be sufficient in certain situations where if the skill just changes the way you look at the level, it just changes the way you look at things. It doesn't even have to have a conscious impact in terms of like, oh man, I can't wait. It just changes the way you think about things, and the player never even really notices how the skill impacts their gameplay. Like that can happen. That can 100% happen. But by this definition, it wouldn't be a good skill. And this is why I don't like. This is why I'm not a big fan of. This is why I'm not a huge fan of the idea of Mark Brown as educational content, because it doesn't work as educational content. But the case of testing game feel for certain mechanics, yeah, testing game feel can be tough. There's things you can do in terms of like connecting data that you collect with qualitative data. Like you ask a bunch of players some questions and you collect a bunch of data and you like line it up, and you can say something like, you can do something like 90% of players are making this decision in this instance, and then when we ask them which thing they prefer, it's like 50-50. Even though 90% of players are doing this thing, like that says a different thing about the gameplay experience, right? That tells you something about the gameplay experience that you wouldn't be able to get if you just asked the players directly. You need to be a little bit, it's like experimentation, right? You need to be a little bit almost underhanded about it. And yes, you're effectively relying on your own sort of experience, which if your conclusion is ultimately, I don't know, figure it out, which is kind of what ends up, if you're following this, if you're taking this as advice. I keep accidentally saying if talking about like him giving this advice, which I shouldn't do. It's not him giving this advice, because again, I'm pretty sure Game Maker's Toolkit is more about general appreciation, etc., and less about what's it called? More about general appreciation and less about education. So I shouldn't say it's him giving advice. That's not accurate. It's more about, if you're taking this as advice, don't. Because it's not really good advice for an aspiring designer. It's not going to help you solve the problems that you need to be solving that are just really hard problems to solve. They're just hard problems to solve. And you need to be creating this large, high-level sort of internally cohesive thing. Very, very tricky.
Excited to finally unlock it, and then eager to go into the world and use it. Back to Origins for a second, I found myself caught in a really engaging loop where
So yeah, I think it is mostly about sort of, I would say game appreciation is the primary goal. Like look at how complex and difficult and cool game design can be, which is a good goal. Like that's fine. I have zero problem with that goal. I think the issue is that he's not really conveying design concepts in a way that, and this is why it's mostly about looking at games and building appreciation, because the concepts that he presents and the way that he presents them are pretty hollow if you look at them as like, oh, here's how to design. Because it does nothing to look at process. It does nothing to look at what a creative problem solving in design looks like. It does nothing to help you like establish a vision or work within a vision or establish an internally consistent concept. None of that applies at all. Which is why I think it's mostly about like, here's a basic concept. Isn't it cool that the designers thought about this stuff kind of thing, which is fine. None of this is meant to be like a Mark Brown roast. That's not the point. The only point is to build the argument of like, this is not good educational content, which it's not supposed to be. I don't think it's supposed to be, but there are some people using it that way, and I would just say to those people, don't use it that way.
And missions, which gave me enough experience points for another ability.
So I think a lot of this is going to be.
Oh, and don't feel the need to add in crappy skills just to boost the numbers.
Oh.
Some skill tree designers obviously believe that bigger is better.
All right. So I do have an issue with this statement. This time I have an issue with this statement specifically. That is not at all necessarily the case. Some games want to reward you for being very careful about how you create a character and how you craft that character, and reward players who are better at it. Right? Path of Exile, the game that he's showing here, Path of Exile is great at driving this idea that a player who's good at building a character is gonna have a stronger character than a player who's not good at building a character. And to look at that as a problem takes it, again, back into the subjective. That's not inherently a problem. An objective statement would be the thing that I said. A bigger skill tree is going to do more to reward players who are good at character building and min-maxing, and then make those characters stronger. Now, keep in mind, when I say an objective statement, I don't mean objectively true statement. I mean an objective statement, which is just to say that the statement can be proven true or false. Like, we could test it and see if that's accurate. We'd have to define what it means to be good at character building and all that. We'd have more work to do for sure, but we could easily get to the point where we're talking about, like, yes, this is a statement that we can make that we can then go test and see if that's correct or not. But this statement bothers me, this idea of some skill tree designers obviously believe that bigger is better. Now, I don't know what the intent here is, but it feels a little bit condescending. This idea of, like, some designers clearly don't know what they're doing because they make these big skill trees, but they're probably just trying to accomplish something that you're not aware of. Usually it's better to assume the competence of the designers because they probably know better than you. The idea that they would have missed, the problem, the skill tree is too big, is a little silly. And now Path of Exile has been around a long time and it's like in an evolutionary design, so maybe it is just a sort of a problem of bloat in terms of like feature creep. But that doesn't mean that a big skill tree is inherently a problem. Even if you could, like, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Path of Exile was never meant to have a big skill tree and that it was totally a blunder on the fault of the designers, even if you could prove that, you cannot then also conclude, big skill tree's bad. You cannot conclude that. This is where I'm starting to have big problems.
Skill forests for Path of Exile and Sultan Sanctuary, but if you ask me, a tightly pruned bush with a handful of truly interesting upgrades is often the best.
All right. The often qualifier here bugs me because if you're trying to teach design, again, I don't think he's trying to teach design, but if you're trying to, if let's say you're trying to learn design and you look at this and you see someone say often the best solution, your first question should be, when is it the best solution? How do you know it's the best solution? What does best solution mean? And how do you determine what best equals from a specific context where the context is the game you're building? How do you do that? Those are useful answers to someone learning game design. Generally, try to do smaller but clearer skill trees doesn't help solve any problems. It doesn't help you with your problem solving process. It doesn't help you, like, learn or do anything effectively. It just is a statement. It just is a statement. And the often qualifier makes it even not a very useful subjective statement because he's saying, a small skill tree, small focused skill tree is going to be better than a big unfocused skill tree. But he's leaving himself space, right? It's often the best solution.
Another issue plaguing skill trees is the actual process of earning these skill points. Most games give you the points simply for playing the game normally, which feels like a missed opportunity.
So we've already talked about the Skyrim problem, right? Or not the problem, but the Skyrim comparison where that's how that works, right? Also, and this happens a few times where I watch a video like this, not necessarily Game Maker's Toolkit, but like I watch a video or something that talks about some like inherent game design wisdom of like, well, this should be this way. And I always think of D&D because, I mean, of course I do. But D&D is just a game that does all the things that all these people are saying you shouldn't do. There's a lot of randomness. The randomness happens after you make decisions. You level up just from doing the thing that you're doing anyway. Like, these aren't inherent problems. Leveling up by virtue of fighting and then gaining skills that make you fight better is a really small and tight gameplay loop. So if small and tight is good and big and not tight is bad, then why don't I just shift the perspective to small tight gameplay loops instead of small tight skill trees? Now big skill trees can make small tight decision loops, and also having the player have to do things that the skill tree doesn't help you do makes a bigger, less tight gameplay loop. Now, I know he never really made the statement that smaller and tighter is just better, but it was a little bit implied, and my point is just they're not very good objective statements, because as soon as you shift the perspective, the statement no longer applies, or it actively works against the thing that you're trying to suggest.
Let's go back to Prey, which has these neuromod tools, the game's version of skill points, as physical objects in the world. This means you have to go out there and find them, maybe by exploring the different nooks and crannies of Talos 1, or by doing side quests. Choosing how to dole out these skill points allows the designer to encourage a certain playstyle, or to make players...
That's true. I mean, that's true. It does encourage a certain playstyle, and if you give skill points for leveling up, which then help, or skill points for exploring, and the skill points get you like combat skills, and then those combat skills help you fight, then you have this little loop where you can have it so that the player explores, whatever that means. You'd have to define that as a gameplay beat, which is a whole thing. But you define exploration, you go, that's the gameplay beat where you get skill points, and then you spend those on attack upgrades, which you use to attack things and do combat. And then when you start having a lot of trouble with combat, you go, oh, it's time to explore more so I can get more upgrades so I can do combat better. And you can use difficulty as a way to determine when it's time to go do exploring, and players will generally do most of the exploring, but also they'll be able to do it at their own pace. As in, once combat starts to get to be overwhelming, they go explore. Or they can anticipate combat getting more difficult and go and do a bunch of exploration. It doesn't really matter. Either way, they're in the loop. No problem. That's all absolutely true.
Content, like in Zelda.
And I think that's an excellent, that's an excellent way of using a skill tree that has nothing to do with making a skill tree have really clear, concise decisions between each skill. You don't need that at all. If your skill tree drives that loop, then who cares? It almost doesn't matter what's on the skill tree. The skill tree can just have a bunch of like +1 to damage stuff or whatever. It doesn't matter at that point. And again, as we've talked about, having skills or having decision points that aren't necessary can detract from your game if you're not very clear on what that decision point is.
Where spirit orbs, which can be cashed in for health and stamina upgrades, are given for completing these shrines.
Mm-hmm.
That essentially turns the entire world of Hyrule into...
That's a bizarre statement, but I guess. Yeah, the loop in Breath of the Wild is reasonably solid. It's a well-founded gameplay loop. Yeah. This isn't a Breath of the Wild thing, but overall, I think it's a solid gameplay loop. The upgrade system is okay. There are some issues with it, I think. For example, there are situations that seem to not quite require, but it's so much more handy to have health over stamina or vice versa in certain circumstances without much prompting, and that goes back to the hallway problem. But overall, it's solid. I overall agree. The idea that it's one giant skill tree doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but overall,
towards improving their character rather than randomly getting stat boosts as they play. This reminds me of Far Cry 3's crafting system. In that game, I knew I wanted a better gun holster, and the menu told me that I needed to get a few pelts from a certain animal. So I paused the main quest, found the animal's breeding ground on my map, and went hunting for pelts until I had enough to afford the holster. I wanted an upgrade, and had to figure out
this is more or less what I was just talking about, and what he mentioned with
towards that goal. Getting
already.
The sprint
Which
slide,
mostly,
though,
yeah.
well, I just played the game a bit more.
Mostly just, yeah. But also, again, the important thing to really consider here is how does this drive the gameplay loop? What is the function of this in your game? What does it do? Right? Like he mentioned, because he mentioned very abstractly, like it can incentivize certain decisions, which is like a nice overall statement, but how does it incentivize certain decisions? How do we make it incentivize certain decisions? How do we define what those decisions should be? Now, if you're doing a video on skill trees, you don't necessarily have to also do a video on building a gameplay vision. I understand. But these questions left hanging make all of the wisdom, as it were, in the video more or less moot.
Some skill points. Look, you don't really need to encourage the player to simply play through the main missions. That's why they bought the game in the first place.
Yes, but sometimes if your game isn't very Very good. Or if the player is just like not having a good time with the game, like they might just
use the promise of skill points to
I don't know about you guys, but I've definitely stopped playing games halfway through, just being like, this is not, I'm bored.
to encourage other ways.
That's not really necessarily related to the skill tree stuff, but the idea of using skill points to drive interest is, I don't think, necessarily a problem. For one thing, mystery as an experience, I like to define mystery as ignorance plus interest. Like those two things together creates mystery. If you have ignorance but no interest, then you don't know and don't care, right? If you have interests but no ignorance, then you know a thing and you care about it. But if you have both, you care about knowing a thing that you don't yet know. That's mystery. Now, driving ignorance is easy. Driving interest is hard, but if you can use a progression system to drive interest, and then you have ignorance, you can find ways to weave like world lore in with the gameplay so that you have interest plus ignorance. Now I'm also being pretty abstract, but that's mostly by virtue of time. But the point is, you can like layer interest plus ignorance in ways that drive mystery. And that can take someone that might not normally be invested in narrative and drive them along the path of narrative, which is something that you can do in D&D, for example.
To play skillfully or play on harder difficulties.
We need to start
more and so on. But be careful about
I am not familiar with Outer Wilds at all, I'm afraid, but that sounds neat.
The sort of gameplay you
I should look into Outer Wilds. I've heard a few good things about it. We're gonna start trying to go through this fairly quickly.
Where players
hey, Skyrim!
For performing certain actions can persuade players to just craft dozens of daggers simply to boost their crafting skill.
That's true.
You don't want to encourage grinding.
It's true that happens, but the idea that you shouldn't encourage grinding, just as a general like abstract rule of game design, ridiculous. Ridiculous. MMOs wouldn't exist. Like, he doesn't like grinding. That's fair. He doesn't want to grind in a game. That's fine. There are a lot of games that utilize grinding that probably shouldn't, where the grinding itself doesn't do anything to drive the gameplay experience. But in general, I am not a fan of anyone that says a game should not have X. Yes, well, Dark Souls is a great example of this, right? When you grind in Dark Souls, it's usually because you're having a lot of trouble on a spot, and then when you grind and get powerful and beat the boss, the loop is like I don't know very many people who grind in Dark Souls just to grind in Dark Souls. I mean, I'm sure they're out there. But generally speaking, when someone grinds, I would expect it to be someone is encountering a boss, they're having a lot of trouble with the boss, they can't beat the boss, so they go back and just try to like level up their equipment, try to level up their character, try to get more stats, more strength, more whatever. And then they go back and fight the boss, and then they destroy it. The concept of over leveling in Dark Souls is really common. If you look at Dark Souls communities, people are always like, oh, you only had, that boss was only easy because you were over leveled for it. The concept of being over leveled is insane. That's not a real thing. That's a thing that the community has made up, right? But the idea, so that suggests that grinding is a relatively commonly used way of getting around a boss that you're having a particularly difficult time with. That's great, because that means patience is one potential solution to the problem. That's what grinding does, is it makes one of the ways that you can solve your problems through the tool of applying patience. Now, there are games when applying the tool of patience is inappropriate for the gameplay experience. But when you say you shouldn't encourage grinding, what you're effectively saying is patience should never be a primary method by which you solve a problem in a game. Which, if you frame it like that, sounds utterly absurd.
Or gameplay that doesn't fit the core experience.
You don't want to encourage grinding or gameplay that doesn't fit the core experience. So yes, I agree that you shouldn't create gameplay that doesn't fit the core experience. But based on all of the other things he said, sometimes those things are going to conflict. Sometimes, what if grinding fits the core experience, right? Now you can't follow his advice. It's impossible. So contextually, that can be a contradiction in terms. Not always, but it can
Final
be.
issue is that these skill menus are pretty boring to navigate.
It's a UI problem. UI designers are pretty good at making skill menus not that boring to navigate.
It looks like you're buying travel insurance or something. This is not a huge deal in an expansive
We need to
like
kind of
The
speed through
Witcher,
this.
but it can
Plus, we're
massively
reiterating a
slow
lot of the same
pace
points.
of a lightning quick game like Doom. So just make them quicker, like in Downwell, where it
So again, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But again, and at least he's being kind of consistent in the sense that a big skill tree, for example, would be very difficult to navigate. But since we've already discussed why sometimes you might want a big skill tree, the idea of making the skill tree quick to navigate also doesn't make any sense. If you're playing, I'm gonna make a tabletop reference that isn't D&D, although it might as well be. If you're playing Pathfinder has so many character options. So many character options. The process of building a character can take days or weeks because there are so many options. And then when you level up, sometimes you have to make a choice between the same ridiculous breadth of options. Building the character is such an important and integral part of that gameplay experience that the advice of make it faster is actively terrible advice. It's not just abstract and not that meaningful. It's advice that you should absolutely not follow in that instance. Yes, I agree 100%. He's looking at games and going, I felt like this menu was too slow. Just like your pacing example. He's saying, the menus are too slow. It's exactly the same as the pacing example, because he's saying the menus are too slow. What does that mean? It means he wishes these menus were faster. He wants to get in and out of the menus faster. But if you have a game that's about character building, or a deck building game, right? If there's a deck building game that incorporates progression, then you want to be very slow and methodical about building that deck. It's most of the game. Half the game is building the deck. Why would you want to rush players through that process? Let them go slow, take their time, right? It's like conventional wisdom in TTRPGs like Pathfinder and D&D that level ups come at the end of a session. And the reason that's so common is because you want to give the player time to ruminate on those choices, because character building is a big part of it. So if character building is really important, and there's a lot of decisions, if character building is really important, then it may be that you want to give your player a lot of options. If character building is important, and you give your player a lot of options, you probably also want to give your player a lot of time to make those decisions. But you also want to incorporate that into the gameplay loop, because upgrading might just be a beat. It might just be a gameplay beat. A whole gameplay beat in your game might be choosing an upgrade option. Whereas in a game like the ones he's putting up with Doom or Downwell, it's not a whole beat. It's a quick thing, which is fine. It's not objectively wrong to not have... it's not objectively good or bad to have upgrades and progression be a gameplay beat or not.
And away you go. Or just make them automatic. Red Dead Redemption 2 has skill trees for both Arthur and his horse, and these upgrades, for things like boosted stamina and sweet horse tricks, just unlock as you play.
Sure. In a game like that, you probably want them to just unlock as you play. That's fine. That the progression isn't a huge part of that game. It's not that important. It serves other functions. It's not a gameplay beat, so they just happen. Also, by the way, this we're getting into some prickly territory. You might not even define that as a skill tree. You might actually define a skill tree by a specific set of decisions that you have to make. And if you do, then automatically gaining skills on level up might be part of the progression, but it's not part of the skill tree, if that makes sense, depending on the definition. But he's getting squirrely with definitions here.
Even needed skill trees in the first place is another question entirely. The thing about skill trees is there's loads of fun stuff you can do with them. How about skills that offer both advantages and disadvantages?
That is an option, yes.
Or skills that can interlink in various ways.
That is also an option, yes. Those are both options that have different outcomes in gameplay experience. Players will utilize those differently depending on the context.
Where you can only equip a handful at a time.
That's also an option.
I feel like they're one of those systems that's in every game nowadays, simply because they're in every game nowadays.
Maybe. Maybe skill trees serve some really interesting purposes that are a really clean way of solving certain problems, right? For example, because bigger games have a lot more gameplay beats, there's an exploration beat and a combat beat and an upgrade beat and a crafting beat, and there's like all these different gameplay beats. Sometimes a skill tree is a really great, tight, central focus that connects all those beats in a really nice gameplay loop. Just like the example we gave earlier.
But that doesn't make them bad. It's just very easy to get a bit lazy with them.
All right, so I agree, it doesn't make them bad. But the problem is, so the problem there is like he's saying that presumably kind of what he's saying is that if you're doing the things I'm saying not to do, you're being lazy, which I just don't like that as a statement at all.
At the start, or going into a boring menu to get a boring health boost. They're
And
about
again, the idea of being
your
boring.
Experience, about rewarding different ways of playing, and about forcing difficult choices.
Okay, customizing your experience. This is something that's really important. Customizing your experience, the customized experience is an illusion. Just like agency. Agency is an illusion. Game designers, good game designers especially, understand that these things are not real. They're total illusions. And this is exactly the kind of thing, this is what I like to call player analysis. This idea of like, oh, the skill tree should be about customization and things like that, but it's not. It's about the feeling of customization sometimes.
Your experience.
It's about the feeling of different approaches sometimes. About the feeling of those of that agency. Sometimes it's about that, not always.
Let me know about your favorite skill trees in the comments below, and
so yeah, again, it's just, it all comes down to, I feel like, oh hey, he's got this thing.
It's about this crazy sphere grid nonsense from Final Fantasy X.
He brought up Final Fantasy X.
Idea what this thing is.
And he's not even making a point, he's just saying, wow, that's dumb, and moving on. So I would just, if anybody's watching, I just really, really want to stress, do not look at Game Maker's Toolkit as design analysis. It is design appreciation. It's design appreciation. That's what it is. And you know what? To be fair, we need more design appreciation. We need more design appreciation. That's great. It's great to have, and I love that design appreciation is a thing that's out there. I especially love that it's a thing that's out there that's popular. But when something gets popular, it inevitably starts to get used in various different ways. And it's really important, if you're looking at Game Maker's Toolkit, to not look at it as design analysis or design education. It is not design education. It's games appreciation, design appreciation. And it's good at being design appreciation. And just be very careful. It's not just Game Maker's Toolkit, right? This isn't just about like taking Game Maker's Toolkit and trying to be derogatory toward it. Anything that you find out there, whether it's a blog or a video or a post that somebody wrote or something, always ask yourself, if you're trying to be a game designer and you're trying to learn how to design, always ask yourself how this is grounded in process, what the tacit questions might be, and how this is applicable actionably in terms of the creative problem-solving process that game design is. And basically none of this is any of that. It's games, which puts it solidly in the category of design appreciation, not design education. Very different things. Again, no shade intended at Mark Brown, but it is, I think, important to point out these things so that there aren't any misconceptions. That's it. That's actually it. It's been an hour and a half almost, and we went through one sub 10-minute video over the course of over an hour. So if anybody has, as always, we're going to open the floor to just general questions that anybody has for a few minutes, and then we'll probably call it a day for this stream. While questions are popping up, I'd like to remind everyone that you can join us on Discord. Oh my God, let me get that link. I need to get a link. You can join us on Discord at this location. And also, we do events every week. I'm going to be back next Saturday at the same time for... I think we'll probably do another design along. We'll see. If you're one of our elite members, you can vote. But I may just do a design along again because I think that was a really good event. We have other events in the pipeline, like ideas that we're ruminating on. You can check us out on YouTube, youtube.com/Game Design Academia. You know what? I should get that link too. Let me do that. Here you go. That's the YouTube. Check us out on YouTube. I mean, that's pretty much it. If there are no questions, then we're going to call it a day. We're going to call it a day there. Give it another couple minutes because of the stream lag. If you do have a question, maybe just let me know that you have a question so that I don't, before you type up the question, so that I don't, or comment or whatever, so that I don't cut you off. Because I think we're about to call it. Give it just a minute. I'll just sit here and just wait for a minute. Hands off, not touching anything. Okay, it looks like we have no questions. As always, this will go up as a VOD on the YouTube channel later, and you can check it out on Twitch also, unedited. Thanks, guys, for showing up. That was good. I had a good time. I think it's important to do this kind of thing, to look at this kind of thing and like break it down and go, why does this analysis not work very well? Or why is it not very good to use if you're trying to learn how to be a game designer, is really the more pointed question there. And I hope to see all of you around the Discord. Okay, goodbye. I'll see you next week for whatever the event is. Same day, same time. Thanks for coming. Goodbye. Goodbye.